Welcome everyone. It's the 13th of June 2023 and just 3 minutes after 1 to open the Climate Action Commission today. And I'll just open with here. Kataka te hau ki te uru, ka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki. He hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauri ora. So, welcome everyone. It's great to have a good number of committee members in the room, and I'll just see about, I'm sure I can see everyone that's online as well. And welcome to all the staff that have tuned in. We've got a guest coming for our first item, so I imagine that's why a lot of people are here as well as with that draw card. We'll just get through the first piece, which is the confirmation of the for the apologies, which are up on screen. Sorry. So I've received apologies from Councillor Graf and Councillor Downard for absence, and I have apologies from the majority, if not all the rest of the committee, for early departure, but they're at different stages. So just as a heads up, I sent an email out yesterday saying we were going to try and get through this really, really quickly. But we do have up until just after 3, the quorum, as I understand, so that we can continue to go through our items until then. So if I just move the apologies, and if I can get a seconder. Thank you, Ben. Then all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. And it's great to see yourself online, Dr. Rod Carr. Thank you for joining us. I've got one more item, and then I will introduce you to the group and vice versa. So the next item is just confirmation of the agenda. Yep, just tidying up that wording, that the agenda will be confirmed as it was advertised. And we've got the piece in there that if it had to sit longer than 2 hours, we are all covered. So Ben, are you happy to move that one? And Pamela, second. Fantastic. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Fantastic. And one more section, disclosures of interest. Does anybody, committee members, have any extra items that they wish to raise in regards to this agenda? Silence. So we are all good to go. So our first item on the agenda is Dr. Rod Carr, Chair of the Climate Commission, who joins us to discuss the Commission's draft advice on to the government on the second emissions reduction plan. The Council is preparing a submission to the Commission of that draft advice, and it's our opportunity as a committee to understand what the advice might mean for New Zealand and the Waikato, and to help us shape our submission, which we will be deciding on the 27th, I believe, of June in the Strategy and Policy Committee coming up. So welcome, Rod. And my name is Jennifer Nicol. We've met a few times now, which is great. It's been great to see you and the work of the Commission grow over time. I did read the full draft advice last night, very late. So if I make any omissions today, it's because I didn't get quite enough sleep. But thank you very much for that. Can we just see if we can hear you? If you could just.
Kia ora, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Fantastic. Well, we were kind of thinking we'll give you about 30 minutes to give us a bit of an intro of what you'd like to say, and then we have up to about 30 minutes to ask various questions and have some discussion two-way. Does that work for you?
Yes, indeed. Kia ora. Ina mana ina iwi tena koutou katoa, ko Rod Carr ahau. Kai whakahaere he Rangi Climate Change Commission. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. You will be relieved to know I am not going to lead you through the entire draft of our advice. That today is an opportunity for me to help guide you a little in thinking about things climate, the role of the Commission, and also the fact that we are out with a draft set of advice and proposed recommendations for consultation, as has already been described. So let me just back up the bus a little bit and try and provide some context. First of all, in 2019, 119 members of the New Zealand Parliament, in fact, all those present on the day, voted to change New Zealand's Climate Change Response Act 2002 in a bill that was known as the Carbon Zero Bill, that became the Carbon Zero Act, that established targets for New Zealand's reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement that we signed up to in 2015. It also put in place some institutional arrangements to help our elected leaders make decisions that would be consistent with meeting both our international obligations under the Paris Agreement, but also recognising the challenges and opportunities that New Zealand would face as it both reduced emissions from its activities and lifestyles, but also adapted to the climate change that is already going to happen. So 2019 saw the establishment of the Climate Change Commission, a commission that is essentially appointed on the recommendations of a nominating committee after cross-party consultation, and members are then appointed by the Governor-General and serve in office until the end of their terms or until removed for various rather obnoxious kind of reasons if we really screw up. The long and the short of it is that the Commission is set up to provide advice to the government of the day on a range of matters and to make sure that that advice is independent, expert-based, and made transparent to all New Zealanders. But the Commission has no decision rights. We don't set any prices. We don't make any regulations. We don't levy any penalties or fines. And we can initiate no inquiries into matters related to the climate. We are purely advisory to the government of the day. It is the New Zealand Parliament that established our targets. And it was quite simple. It was that by 2050, New Zealand should be net zero in all gases emitted, the greenhouse gases, other than biogenic methane, where it was already agreed that the science of the time was that methane is a different kind of gas, behaves differently in the atmosphere, and therefore is deserving of a unique quantitative target of its own. And that target was that biogenic methane emissions need to be reduced, but not to zero, and that they cannot effectively be offset the way carbon dioxide can be. And the target that was set was that by 2050, we should reduce biogenic methane by 24 to 47% from its 2017 levels. And that as a milestone on the way to achieving that, we should see a reduction in biogenic methane by 10% from its 2017 levels by 2030. And those are our targets. They're quite simply stated. They were agreed after long debate. They were informed by science. But the legislation also said that we don't know what we don't know. So there will be the opportunity for the targets to be reviewed. And the first of those target reviews will be informed by advice from the Climate Change Commission provided by the end of 2024, the end of next year. The Commission will provide advice about the targets, and if under the Act certain triggers are triggered, then we may recommend a change to targets, and that advice will lie with the government of the day for them to choose what to do with it. But having set targets, our Parliament was also mindful of the fact that targets without a means of achieving them would be useless, aspirational but useless. So the Commission was tasked with providing advice to the government on emissions budgets for periods between now and moving towards 2050 and subsequent years. The idea was that these emissions budgets would help measure progress towards achieving our targets, and that the first budgets would cover the period out till 2035, trying to create a longer-term series of parameters so that action could be taken. But again, budgets without a plan to achieve them is pretty meaningless. So the Act sets up the process of a government of the day receiving independent advice from the Commission to put in place emissions reduction plans. The plans are for 5-year periods, and the first plan on which we advised in 2021 was to see a plan for the period out to 2025. The government then received that advice, consulted on it, and in the middle of last year put in place New Zealand's first emissions reduction plan, again halfway through the plan period. We're now in the process of consulting on an emissions reduction plan for the period 2026 to 2030. The budget for that period is already in regulations. So this is about what actions do we recommend the government take in forming the direction of policy that would best support achieving those emissions budgets. We'll come back to our draft advice shortly. The Commission also has some other responsibilities, one of which is to monitor progress against emissions budgets and plans that have been put in place. And our first monitoring report is due in the middle of next year. The Commission is also responsible for monitoring progress against our National Adaptation Plan. The government put that plan in place, and our first progress report is again due in the middle of next year. In addition, when it comes to the review of targets, advice on which is due at the end of next year, the Act requires us to give advice as to whether emissions from international aviation and shipping should be included in our domestic emissions budgets and plans. And finally, in 2026, we have a responsibility to advise on the next risk assessment for New Zealand. It is increasingly obvious that while reducing emissions in line with our Paris Agreement is not only an obligation we have to humanity, but it is also a significant opportunity for New Zealand to create a thriving, low emissions and climate resistant economy. That increasingly by the middle of this century, the products and services that humanity is going to want and need will be those associated with low emissions. That producing those products and services will be in our own best interests. And more importantly, living in a society that has reduced its emissions, particularly from the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air, will be in our own self-interests. But whatever we do now, it looks like humanity has put itself on a pathway to test the 2 degrees warming that we have often said we need to avoid. While the Paris Agreement refers to well below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible, if all of the countries' pledges that have been made were actually achieved, the estimate is that global warming will be between 2.4 and 2.8 degrees Celsius above the levels measured between 1850 and 1900 by the end of this century. And why does that degree of warming alarm people? Well, it is estimated that in the last 300 million years, planetary average surface temperatures have oscillated between -4 degrees Celsius and +2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. That while there have been times in this planet's history, there have been up to 10 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as we measure today, in no part of recorded history have levels of carbon dioxide risen so fast from the level that we see today. And the ability of our natural ecosystems to respond and adjust to the pace of change would be unprecedented. that the extinction of species is already occurring, and it has occurred in the past. But it is clear that as a result, largely of the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air in the last 150 years, we are terraforming. We, human beings, are changing the temperatures on this planet. That when you go to bed tonight, there will be more carbon dioxide in the air than has ever been breathed by any human being we would recognize. And you wake up in the morning tomorrow, there will be even more carbon dioxide in the air. Global temperatures are currently rising at excess of 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. And there is little evidence that we are taking the action necessary at the scale and pace needed to avoid the temperature rise which is unfolding. So what does that all mean for New Zealand and the Climate Change Commission's advice? After we gave our first round of advice, we got feedback that it would be more helpful to decision makers if we gave fewer recommendations that prioritised what mattered most and had the most urgency. So before we set about drafting our proposed recommendations, we had a huge discussion about our prioritisation framework, which is outlined in our draft advice. And we came up with 6 criteria for thinking about what mattered most. Firstly, we talked about what the potential of the mitigation was. In other words, let's advise on things that were the most practical, most real, and most useful things to do soonest, that had scale, were supported by scientific evidence, that technology was already or imminently available, that they were economically feasible and cost effective. That secondly, we would focus on the gap in policy or our ability to achieve equitable and sustainable transitions. That these are the gaps which impede action and change and challenge our elected leaders to get stuff done. That thirdly, the pace and timing of the ability of a policy to contribute to achieving the emissions budget 2 for the period 2026 to 2030 and emissions budget 3 for 2030 to 2035. We would also take into account risks, including the risk of achieving what was being proposed, the permanence of gross emissions reductions, and the permanence of any removals on our pathway to net zero. And the last 2, equity. How we needed to prioritise distributional equity, that is, who's bearing these costs and is that fair? Intergenerational equity, where is the voice for the unborn generations that are going to live with the consequences of our choice or failure to choose? Equity between sectors, whether it's the urban, rural, whether it's the energy sector or the transport sector, whether it's a choice between the agricultural sector or other sectors such as tourism. How do we balance regional impacts? Because clearly different regions have different mixes of economic activity, different emissions profile, and different choices about how to live. The impacts on different social groups who may or may not be vulnerable and may or may not be unable to respond to the policies that are being put in place. And the Crown Maori relationship. It is very clear that this country has an agreement about how we should develop public policy. And it does mean that Te Tiriti is not an optional extra to how we should think about progressing policy guidance for a government of the day. And finally, co-benefits. It is pretty clear that combusting fossil fuels in the open air is bad for our health. The Ministry of Health estimates that nearly 3,500 New Zealanders every year die either directly or indirectly as a result of inhaling the particulates from the combustion of fossil fuels near ground level. In other words, motor vehicle emissions. So we can build not only a more prosperous, more vibrant society, but we can build a healthier one by reducing emissions of all gases from all sources as soon as we can. The Commission's proposed recommendations and draft advice are outlined in the document out for consultation at present. We made 19 recommendations on this occasion, although in the first emissions reduction plan adopted by the government, there are more than 300 proposed actions. And it's a reminder that the role of the Commission is to give government advice on the direction of policy, not to prescribe and regulate specific policy initiatives. And therefore, we are seeking your input on whether we've got it roughly right in terms of the priorities for action and the direction that policy should take. It will be for other government agencies to flesh out or colour in exactly what the direction of policy would look like in the terms of black letter regulation, be it around emissions pricing, be it around import controls, be it around phase out or ban by dates on various high emitting technology when low emitting alternatives may already exist. In respect of our advice, iwi Māori are an important part of this journey for a whole bunch of reasons. And we have a number of recommendations that go directly to trying to raise the capability of iwi Māori to engage in the policy development process. And also for iwi Māori groups to be resourced adequately to adapt to changing climate and changing policy settings. In recommendation 4, for example, we encourage the government to explore and implement mechanisms to allocate resources directly to iwi and funding to Māori land owners. It turns out, in many cases, how Māori land is owned can be an impediment to lower emitting choices for land use. But it is also the case that many iwi Māori groups lack the resources to be able to respond and make the kinds of submissions that public policy development in New Zealand today requires. In recommendation 5, we recommend that we resource integration of Mataranga Māori into policy design. This is not some hand waving at spiritualism. This is indeed a recognition that Mataranga Māori, or forms of Māori knowledge alongside our traditional Western science, give us a wider tapestry to draw on for creation of public policy. And that in Mataranga Māori, we can challenge some of the notions that have driven us to the circumstances we find ourselves in today, where unreasonable focus on the short term, on monetized costs and benefits, and on unrealistic assumptions about how people behave have led us to a situation of challenging how we are going to progress now that the science is clear and even the direction of public policy is now also relatively clear. I won't go through the other recommendations, but there are a number of them where it is not just about iwi Māori, it is about all of us and how on this journey which we must take together, we can benefit by being inclusive, we can benefit by widening the scope of ideas that can be contributed. In the New Zealand context, there are 4 limbs to how we will achieve emissions reduction. Firstly, we must decarbonise the production and use of energy in New Zealand. While we talk extensively about our 85% renewable electricity generation, actually only 40% of all the energy that is used in New Zealand comes from renewable sources. We still will use coal, large amounts of liquid fossil fuels and petroleum products such as petrol and diesel, and we burn fossil gas. So that decarbonisation journey will be critical. Electrification is one means by which we can decarbonise some of our energy requirements. We can do that, but we need to build out quite dramatically the amount of renewable electricity produced in New Zealand today, using and deploying known technologies at pace and scale. We need to decarbonise transport, partly by mode shift to walking, cycling and shared transport, and partly by the uptake of low and no emissions transport technologies at pace and scale. We need to decarbonise process heating. That is, when we need heat in industry, particularly low and medium temperature process heat, we should not be burning fossil fuels such as coal and fossil gas. We need to make sure that we put ourselves on a pathway for built environments, that is our towns and cities, our industrial, commercial and residential buildings, that enable us to build with low emissions and live our lives with low emissions. And finally, we need to figure out how to reduce the emissions from agriculture. The world is going to figure out how to produce milk and meat protein with lower emissions per kilo. The world is already on that pathway. Through breeding, feeding, and feed supplements, we're already seeing in Europe and parts of North America significant reductions in biogenic methane associated with protein production. We need to get on board or we will be left behind. All of these things are known today. We do not need to wait for fairy dust and flu powder in order to begin to take the actions to make the progress that will leave New Zealand in a better place. The Climate Change Commission's work shows that delay will cost us. It will cost us as a result of the consequences of others getting ahead. It will cost us because eventually we will need to act, but we will have to act with more urgency the longer we delay. And increasingly, it is obvious that the opportunities that are denied to us by a slower pace of change will have real opportunity costs to us this century and to our children in centuries to come. I am very happy to take your questions. Kia ora.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for your presentation. The advice is so appreciated considering we need to navigate such a complex topic. And I appreciate the positivity and opportunity that you keep reiterating around how there is the potential to actually have a better outcome for all the various reasons you've mentioned, as well as the conciseness of the recommendations in the latest piece so that we can get that prioritization for us as well, because a few councillors, but especially very many staff read, I'm sure, every line and try and read between the lines as well of the advice as to what local government could do best to support. And so while my committee members gather their thoughts on a first question or two, one of mine was actually around realising that your mandate is to give advice to central government, whether there are ways or whether mandate would need to be extended for you for the Commission to give more advice to local government as the other government of a different scale, or perhaps to assist us as the Future for Local Government has so far in its draft advice pointed out, to work together better towards common outcomes. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, look, I feel for local government because I think local government is in the front line of climate adaptation. So as the climate changes, the manifestation of climate events in the form of weather and localities really hits hard on local governments. That's the front line where the reality is going to be increasingly frequent and severe weather events. People often say to me, is this just weather or is this climate? And the reality is that weather is with us all the time. What the climate science is telling us is that what we can expect is because there is more energy in the warmer atmosphere, you are going to find that climate events are more severe and more frequent. That as a result of the warmer air carrying more water, and as a result of the interface between oceans and land having a bigger gradient of climate difference, you're going to find that there is more rain and it's in different places, that there are more droughts and they too may be in different places, and there may be more storms as well. And while we have focused recently on rain events, there's no doubt with the change in the Great Southern Oscillation from La Nina to El Nino, the risk of drought will be with us in the coming 3 or 5 years. So I think from all of that point of view, I think local governments are inevitably going to find adaptation seems like a much higher priority than mitigation. That said, the mitigation also requires local government when it comes to matters such as consenting for renewable energy deployments, consenting for retrofits of buildings, consenting for all of the things we are going to need in order to get off the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. It is at the local government level that often that regulatory both barrier and opportunity exists. And of course, throughout New Zealand, every local authority is faced with a unique configuration of both townships and communities, ways people earn their living, and the way in which they want to live their lifestyles. So it's hard to say what the one size fits all would be. But I guess the rubric for any local authority is, are we doing all we can to reduce our own emissions? Are we doing all we can to help those who wish to reduce their emissions? And do we have the regulatory pen to reduce any barriers to emissions reduction now or soon? And from that point of view, there is much that local government can do to support emissions reduction in the decade to come.
Thank you for that, because for our council, actually, a large part of our in-house emissions, albeit they are scope 3, will be the organic soils aspect, the peat lands.
Yes.
And so is there anything you can give us some thoughts on as to when, because you mentioned about aviation and shipping kind of coming more into the fold over time, on that topic of organic soil?
So, yeah, yes, soil is really challenging. The first thing I'd say is the Commission has no view as a Commission on that question at this time. What we have said is that where there is robust science and evidence, then over time we are going to see more things measured. But not all the measurements are necessarily going to show that things are better than we thought. So, one of the challenges we'll have is that there will be stakeholders who want us to measure and include, for example, in our emissions trading scheme, things that they believe are sequestering carbon.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side of that will be there are things that are not currently priced in the emissions trading scheme that may be the mirror image of what is included. For example, if you want to include in the emissions trading scheme either emissions avoided or sequestration in wetlands, then where are the limits when you have drained wetlands that are now the source of emissions?
Uh-huh.
That soil carbon in New Zealand varies significantly across New Zealand. What do you do about the 600 million tonnes a year of soil that is lost into our rivers and near shore if you're going to give people credit for erosion control and avoidance? Does it mean you put a levy on those who, having cleared land, allow it to slide into our rivers and sea? So always stakeholders will tell you what they should get paid for, but there is a very short line of people offering to be charged.
Indeed. All right, well, we're staying on the ag topic. I was just going to ask your thoughts on He Waka e Kanoa and the direction of where that's going, because it's so relevant to the Waikato. But then after that, I'll go to
Right. So the Commission was tasked with a particular piece of advice, and then it had another piece of advice that we were requested. So the first piece of advice was advice that the Act required us to do, which was to make an assessment of progress of the agricultural sector to face emissions pricing by the 1st of January 2025. So the Act laid down that was one of the things the Commission would provide advice to the government of the day on. And we were to provide that advice in 2022, given that the Act was passed in 2019, and the Act provided that emissions from agriculture would be priced from the 1st of January 2025. So it was not unreasonable for the politicians to say, well, in 2022, why don't we ask the Commission to give us an assessment of progress towards readiness to face an emissions price. So that was the specific task that the Commission was given. We weren't asked to opine on whether agricultural emissions should be priced, on what the price level should be, on how it should be implemented. We were simply asked for an assessment of progress. What we had on the table by then was the legislation that says if anything hasn't changed on the 1st of January 2025, each farm will be treated as a point of obligation in the emissions trading scheme. And our advice in 2022 was, we don't think it's likely that by the 1st of January 2025, you would actually implement that scheme. And by the way, we actually don't think you should anyway, even if you could. That currently there are 2,500 points of obligation, i.e. emitters and traders in the emissions trading scheme. And if you were going to put every farm in, you'd have 24,000 additional participants, all of whom would need to know their emissions obligation with sufficient confidence to actually be buying units in the emissions trading scheme. And our view was that seems highly unlikely. The stop back then was that you would put the emissions from agriculture into the emissions trading scheme at the processor level. And that means that at the meatworks or dairy factory, a rough standard metric would be used to say, to produce this kilo of meat or milk protein, the average emissions from the average farm would be X, and therefore we'll treat that quantity times emissions as being your liability, Mr. Processor. Now, how the processor finds the money is entirely up to the processor. Do they pass it back to the farmer, or do they in some other way levy their farmers for it? We said that that would be possible because there's only about 80 points of obligation if you go to the processors. But we also said we don't think that's desirable because it doesn't give a signal to an individual farmer that would reward them for adopting lower emitting farming practices and technologies or changing land use. So then we looked at the He Waka Eke Noa proposal as it was presented at that time and reached the conclusion that we thought it unlikely that actually farmers would be ready to do the He Waka Eke Noa version of farm level pricing. Not because they couldn't measure their emissions, but because the He Waka Eke Noa proposal included extending quite extensively the range of on-farm sequestration that would be used either to credit or offset the liability to pay for emissions. And our assessment was that it was highly unlikely that that measurement system could be developed and implemented by the 1st of January 2025. However, we did say if you simplified He Waka Eke Noa's proposal in a number of simple ways, then by the 1st of January 2025, we believed you could implement a farm level pricing system for emissions. That's as far as our advice went on that matter. We were also asked under Section 5K of the Act to provide a report to the Minister on what, if any, financial assistance should be provided to the agricultural sector participants in an emissions pricing scheme. And we looked at various options and put that in front of the government at the same time. So that's where we got to as a commission. And since then, things have unfolded, as you well know. But the commission has not been asked to and has no mandate to provide further advice on those matters at this time.
Thank you. I will pass on to Councillor Ben Dunbar-Smith, who represents our Waiho Piako constituency. Go for it.
Yeah, Dr. Carr, you mentioned that each region is different, and here obviously agriculture is a much greater predominance than in many other areas. Agriculture makes up 69% of our gross emissions by source, compared with just 16% for transport. The big thing we have here in our favour is forestry sector removes 44% of the gross emissions, and that's more than double the national average. I understand your view of forestry has changed since the original. Where does the Climate Change Commission sit in regard to forestry for sequestration? And then a second point is, what is the view on riparian planting and the ability of that to give farmers an incentive to actually A, plant, and B, somehow gain credits back for what they're doing?
So let's start with the second one first, because that's pretty clear. The Commission has always said, if sequestration meets the criteria that the Paris Agreement sort of outlined, which is basically it has to be additional. It's not something that nature was doing anyway. It's not something that was happening before 1990. If it is truly additional and it's measurable and it's permanent and it's enforceable, then there's no reason why it shouldn't count in, call it the emissions trading scheme or national inventory accounting. But it's those four things: permanence, additionality, measurability, and enforceability. And now with satellite imaging and the records we have, it is quite conceivable that you can measure the additionality and permanence of things like riparian planting or smaller woodlots than we have in the past. And therefore, from that point of view, there would be no impediment to including those in the ETS. The reason they weren't included originally was that a lot of reliance was placed on aerial photography for saying what was and what was not the land use at the end of 1989. We're now at a point where how far back you look depends on how much imagery you have in order to provide an auditable, verifiable answer to that question. And my understanding is that from around about 2008, we have good satellite imagery for most of New Zealand that would enable you to say, is this something that has been created since and is therefore truly additional? Is it measurable? Probably yes now. Is it enforceable? Yes, because it's onshore under New Zealand law. And is it permanent? Well, the way we deal with permanence is to say if you chop it down, you have to surrender the units that you accredited when you got the credits when you grew it up. So I think the riparian plantings and small woodlots, the Commission has always been advising new science, new measurement would enable you to count more things, and that would be only reasonable. Some of the other issues are much more complicated in terms of those criteria. If we come back to the Commission's view on forestry, I think we need to be a bit careful about what people say the Commission has said and what the Commission has actually said. So in our demonstration pathway in Anaya Tonu Nei, which was our advice on the first emissions reduction plan, we modelled the reference case of exotic plantings in New Zealand. That's if you don't make any changes, what do we think will happen? And that reference case saw about 1.1 to 1.2 million additional hectares of exotic plantings on top of the 2 to 2.1 million hectares we have today out by 2035. Right? So that was the trajectory that we thought we were on back in 2021. The Commission expressed the view that we thought that that may not be in New Zealand's best interests. And our demonstration pathway had about 380,000 additional hectares of exotic planting and about 300,000 additional hectares of native planting by 2035. We saw the exotics as being those that would provide us a short-term buy some time fix, and the natives, because they're slower but longer growing and sequestering, as providing the offsets post-2050 to hold New Zealand at net zero long life gases 2050 and beyond, because those native forests would keep sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for decades to come, offsetting the hard-to-abate emissions that we would be left with by then. So that's what we said, that's what we laid out. Then what became pretty apparent is the way the emissions trading scheme was treating forests was causing a much more rapid conversion of land to forestry purely for carbon credits than the Commission had anticipated. Now, there's no particular problem if that happens quickly for a short period of time, but it is problematic if it goes on and on. And the reason that it is problematic is that we think that you can plant pine forests at roughly $25 to $50 a tonne of sequestration. That's below what we estimate to be what it will cost the economy to decarbonise gross emissions reductions. So the current settings of the ETS, which encourage and allow an unlimited amount of forestry sequestration, is to set New Zealand on a path where gross emissions are much higher for much longer. Forest planting is at a greater pace and scale than maybe in New Zealand's long-term interests. And that while net emissions may come down, we'll find ourselves by 2050 locked into high-emitting technologies because they're being sustained by sequestration offsets and fast-growing pine cover that may now have to be maintained for centuries to come because it represents past emissions. So the conclusion that the Commission reached is the government needs to set targets for gross emissions, not just a net emissions target. And it leads to align the forestry settings within the emissions trading scheme to be consistent with achieving those emissions budgets which line up with that series of targets. So it isn't the case that the Commission doesn't like forests. The Commission's view is that we are now in danger of having the ETS treatment of forestry undermine achieving net zero long life gases by 2050 and thereafter. And it's the and thereafter that is at risk. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, just to go back to the riparian planting, it's the first time I've heard anyone actually say that riparian planting could be an option for the Waikato farmers, for example. It's not something you've put out in your bullet points coming forward.
No, where you'll find it is in our advice on ETS settings and our advice on ETS, rather than specifically, it's one of those things where the direction of policy around the emissions trading scheme is we do need to be careful how much we let in, but choosing what it is, whether it's small woodlots, whether it's riparian planting, whether it's whole farm conversions, those are public policy choices. But what we say is if you let too much sequestration in too quickly for too long, then you'll have no rewards for stopping burning coal or fossil gas or stopping the use of liquid fossil fuels in our cars. And that if we don't stop that, then we'll be stranded in the 2030s and 40s with old high-emitting technology, high-emitting businesses and products and services based on high emissions in a world where increasingly low emissions products and services will be sought and valued.
There's one other question that's come up recently is the need for electricity generation, the need to actually have 170% increase in our electricity production.
Yep.
How viable is that, and within what time frame, and what role can the Waikato play in that?
Yeah, so the Productivity Commission did a bit of a map of New Zealand and looked at where the wind resources are, where the solar opportunities are, what geothermal is already in plan and could be developed. And they concluded that this country probably sits on 3 times the potential renewable energy than we actually need in order to decarbonise New Zealand through electrification. So we don't lack any potential for renewables, onshore, offshore wind, as well as solar and so forth. So those are known technologies that can be deployed today, and those technologies are only getting better. The Boston Consulting Group did a study in which they tried to estimate the total capital cost of decarbonising our electricity production and using electrification to decarbonise the economy, and estimated we needed to deploy about $30 billion of capital between now and 2030 to achieve that opportunity. Now, at some point you say $30 billion sounds like a lot of money. The reality is this is a $400 billion a year GDP. It's an economy where $30 billion would be acceptable and available so long as it earned the rate of return that that capital would expect, which is why we get back to the issue of if it's cheaper to plant trees than to decarbonise, then we have a problem. The opportunities for New Zealand are not unique in the world, but there are very few countries that relative to its population have got the range of choices that New Zealand has. But we do have to get on and exercise those choices. So I'm not fearful about whether we have the potential to generate. We do. I'm not fearful that we couldn't access the capital so long as we choose to allow it to be priced. There is a scarcity of technical skills, you know, boots on the ground and gloves on hands to actually roll this stuff out. So we are going to be in competition with Australia for exactly those same skills because they're on a decarbonisation journey as well. But, you know, much of this is for us to choose.
Thank you. Now, by my timing, it looks like we've got another 5 minutes or so. How's it looking on your end, Rod?
I'm fine. I could go all day.
Oh, me too. But I will try to share it to time. I will just say our chair, Pamela Story, has a question for you.
Kia ora, Dr. Carr. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really, really informative and really helpful in terms of helping to direct some of our thinking. Especially enjoyed that last bit of information around generation. We're looking to review our energy strategy here in the Waikato, and so hopefully we can reflect some of the thoughts you've shared with us in creating a bit of a vision for this region and how we might contribute in that space. Two things I was interested in. The first one was your comment around shipping and
Aviation.
aviation coming in later. Can you help me with the rationale as to why that was delayed?
Yeah. So these are quite complex. Let's take them because each of them is slightly separate. So international aviation, the Paris Agreement couldn't get an accord of how to attribute emissions between sovereign nations. And in the absence of an agreement, that it was really not possible to hold sovereign nations accountable under their nationally determined contributions for a claim on the planet's ability to absorb greenhouse gases and hold temperatures below 2 degrees. So essentially, they kicked that to the international industry body, ICAO, and said, you guys go away and think about not whether aviation has emissions, because it does, and not whether aviation should reduce its emissions, because it should, but how would you go about apportioning emissions between Australia and New Zealand, or the US and Canada, or Canada and Europe, or whatever, in a way that was measurable and defensible and was likely to be acceptable to sovereign nations. So they've been busily working on that for several years. And that was one of the reasons why we didn't include them in our emissions budget or our nationally determined contribution. And the government back in 2019 said, get back to us with some advice about that by 2024, please, Commission. So that's that challenge. Now, in aviation, it's interesting to see what the French have done. They've basically said, look, if you can actually take a high-speed train from city A to city B, you will not be allowed to fly. There will not be a flight from city A to city B. So they're prepared to be quite bold, but they also have a massive investment in public rail, which enables them to make that choice. There are sustainable aviation fuels available in the world today, and it would appear that you can drop them in with up to a 50% replacement rate in existing jet engine technology. The trouble is they cost 5 times per litre what avgas costs today. So unless you can mandate that everybody everywhere has got to achieve a certain mix, the airline that chooses to fuel itself that way will inevitably have higher prices and fewer customers than the airline that continues to fly dirty. So the technology is evolving, but not fast enough to drop the price unless there's some sort of transnational regulation in place. When you then look at the longer term, there's the possibility of using some other zero emission fuel in planes, like hydrogen, but that is a massive retooling of the airline industry, which is estimated to have about $15 trillion of capital invested in current airframes and engines. So a drop in fuel looks likely to be the most sensible way to get to where we need to go. One of the problems with the drop in fuel is if we were to have a 50-50 blend, but twice as many kilometres flown, the world will see the same emissions from aviation as it does today. So that's part of the challenge we face is how do you get to near zero emissions? When it comes to international shipping, again, there's really only half a dozen major shipping lines in the world. So again, there's an international body which is trying to figure out how to reduce emissions from marine freight. And it looks like their technology choices are either biodiesel, which is more expensive than the current diesel, or alternatively, some type of hydrogen, fuel cell hydrogen or otherwise. At least shipping doesn't have the same challenge with the weight or temperatures that you have to contain hydrogen at in order to use it as a fuel source. And that's one of the problems for the airline industry is to keep hydrogen in liquid form, you have to keep it very, very cold, and you have to keep it under quite a large pressure. And the pressure containment vessels have to be quite thick and heavy, so they don't fly well. But on a ship, those constraints are much less rigorous. So I think the shipping industry is looking at options. And then we have the cruise industry, which is a really interesting subset of shipping because it is purely recreational. And it is often done by those who could most afford to pay more. But how we think about all of that is something the Commission has yet to frame up.
Right, and so do I understand that government has asked you to come back with further advice in 2024?
Yes, by the end of 2024, when we do our review of targets, we have to include advice on whether, and if so, how, international aviation and maritime emissions would be included in our domestic emissions budgets.
Right, but your indications are that particularly around the aviation question, that there's not a lot of collective agreement as yet as to how to address that.
I wouldn't want to foreshadow what New Zealand might do, let alone what the Commission might suggest we might do. But to some extent, we are part of a global network of international travel, and how we choose to make that decision depends on a lot of things. So the major source of relatively low cost aviation, sustainable aviation fuel at the moment is California, where it's produced with quite significant federal government subsidies. So it would be the logical pace to pick up your sustainable aviation fuel and fly the Pacific one way. And that may help contribute to an overall emissions reduction profile for an airline if you happened to be flying that route. But you wouldn't fly to LA in order to pick up your cheap aviation fuel.
Right, understand. My second question was, you mentioned that local government is sort of at the coalface. Sorry about that term, because I'm sure that that's quite offensive in this room. But at the coalface of the adaptation space, is there a role for the Commission in asking or encouraging central government to get into that funding conversation? Because I mean, obviously, while we are at our communities are being heavily impacted by this, addressing that adaptation piece it brings us right up against the affordability that our communities can bear. So does the Commission have a role in encouraging central government to weigh in and participate in that?
So only to the extent that we provide an assessment of progress against the National Adaptation Plan. And obviously any assessment of progress has to ask, is this a good plan? If the plan was executed, would it achieve the outcomes? Is the plan being executed and is it achieving the outcomes? And if not, what are the barriers? And then at what point would you give some advice about how you might, achieve the plan or make a better plan? So all of that we have to present by the middle of next year. So that is our role. So in that context, if, for example, we concluded that the plan was a good plan, but it can't be executed because there's not enough resources and the resources are in the wrong place, then that might be something on which we could give some opinion. But we're not there yet, but we will have to be by the middle of next year.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
Right. Then I've got Deputy Chair of this committee, Tipa Mahuta, for the question.
Nei anō te mihi ki a koe mō ngā kōrero. Thank you again for the work that you do and for today's talk. It was really informing. I guess I'm interested in your view. I think you said that in terms of Māori communities' capacity to respond is a lot tied up in the way that the land is owned. But I guess it comes from a perspective where a lot of opportunity has only come to Māori communities through treaty settlements of the last 20 years. So there's a dialogue that I worry about, that I'm concerned about even in councils, that we should green-gate Māori opportunity to protect future generations of the whole community. That by keeping our land locked and natural forests and things like that. And that's our contribution to the national estate when it comes to climate change. I'm interested in your thoughts about that, or where you've heard that conversation. I guess work where there's opportunities on both sides, because it's either we give up the opportunity and protect the whole community and the river and the whatever else, or the wetland, or we enjoy, like everybody else has, an economic opportunity, and then we're held against our own principles. So again, just a bit of unpacking. Keen on your thoughts.
Kia ora, and look, with a huge respect, we have heard a wide range of views from iwi Māori groups across New Zealand. Some of them have articulated precisely the concern that you have, is why would we get locked out of opportunities that others have seized? The Commission absolutely thinks government needs to consult with iwi Māori before it makes decisions about the emissions trading scheme, about emissions reduction plans and so forth. So we're not confused at all. And in the process of developing our advice, we obviously seek to engage with iwi from across New Zealand. That can be challenging, as well there are many calls on iwi to submit on this, contribute to that, be available to be heard by, listened to, consulted with, or ignored by any number of people from Wellington. So we are pretty mindful of the diversity of views within Māoridom, the reluctance that we have to dictate what the right answer is, but the willingness to acknowledge that there are very concerned members of Māori leadership who want to preserve as many options for Māoris to choose how to use land and resources that they are in control of and can influence the control of. So when we come back to the whole question of guardianship of native forest outside the Crown estate, the Commission's view is you want to be very careful about using the emissions trading scheme as the financial reward for that. And part of that is the emissions trading scheme will go out of business at some point, right? As we reduce gross emissions, which we must do, then the obligations on those who are emitting to buy units in the ETS will decline to near zero. And already in our most recent draft advice, we're pointing out that by the middle of next decade, we will be awash with forestry credits to the point where there is a risk that there is a substantial and permanent decline in the value of an NZU in the emissions trading scheme. At about the time, a lot of them will be turning up in the hands of those who have planted forests. Because remember, there is no guaranteed price in the emissions trading scheme. There's a floor price below which the government will offer no additional units. And there's a trigger price if it gets too high, against which they will create new units out of thin air. But the secondary market is completely without a floor. So I think you have to be open to the idea that there is a much bigger and better argument for being recognised as holding estates on behalf of wider communities than just the carbon stored in them. And this is me going off a bit from what the Commission's work is. I think there is a case for creating payments for ecosystem services rendered by those who hold our clean lakes and rivers and native forests. And that should be a payment made to them every year as a stipend and funded from the rest of us. And the question will always be, how do you set that rate and how do you fund it from the rest of us? But I don't think it's realistic to assume that we should just burden those who happen to be residual holders of native forests with an obligation to maintain them for free forever. I don't think that is fair. So I think locking them into the ETS is really dangerous, but I think having the sensible discussion about rewarding those who hold those resources for all of us is really important.
Thank you for that. Again, there's examples of environmental water left in the Murray-Darling scheme, so there are opportunities to further develop that model that I'm sure iwi Māori would be keen to work with you on. So kia ora.
Thank you, Tipa. And Ben, you had one more?
Yeah, it was just, Dr. Carr, you started the discussion with saying that no matter what we do, we're looking at 2.3 to 2.4 degrees heating by the end of the century. Yep.
2.4 to 2.8, but they're just numbers. They're best estimates of rather than precise measurements for.
Now that's assuming that people do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And if we watch the news at the moment, we see the wildfires in Canada, we see wars in Ukraine, we see volcanoes. Are all those taken into account? I mean, I watch the fires as many people do, and I wonder how much carbon is being emitted at that point.
Yeah, and
here's
the problem for the layperson looking at this. It's really hard to get our head around it. But currently, humanity emits about 55 billion tonnes a year of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases warming using GWP 100. So we could have a big debate about the measurement. But anyway, we offset about 10 billion tonnes a year through forestry globally, right? So you're left with about 45 billion, of which 40 billion is actually carbon dioxide. So it's pretty clear that the principal source of this problem is the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. So what we then say is, well, all the active volcanoes that are puffing and puffing on the planet today, their total emissions are 1% of that. That it's hard to get your head around the enormous magnitude of the carbon emissions that we human beings are contributing. But that's the challenge we have. So, yeah, the wildfires are not helpful. And to the extent that they are more frequent and more intense as a result of us having done our emissions is part of the problem. That we've now got the permafrosts in Siberia melting, and they release methane as they warm up or stop being frozen. Can you then say, well, it doesn't matter what we do? Well, I'll tell you what, there's more of them that'll melt faster if we don't stop doing what we can avoid. And that becomes the challenge. It's pretty clear if 2 degrees is bad, 3 degrees is worse.
Now, I just wanted everyone to have the opportunity, so I'll give Stu Kneebone from the Waipa constituency a question, but then we'll look at.
Yeah, look, thanks. Thanks a lot. Just any comment on the ability of pest control to improve the sequestration ability of the vast acreages of native forests we've got in New Zealand that are currently in a pretty poor state?
Yep. So this is a personal view, so don't attribute this to the Commission. I mean, at the moment, we include in our national inventory all of our forests pre-1990, so all of that DOC estate, as if it was a permanent store of carbon subject to very modest annual augmentation. I suspect if anybody did a really serious survey, they would discover that actually the carbon embedded in our native forests may actually be declining. as a result of that pest destruction, which is now so extensive. But I don't know the answer to that. And of course, nobody really wants to go looking in case we actually have a bigger problem than we thought. But it is absolutely clear that we cannot hope to increase the density or increase the footprint of our native forests if we don't get the pests under control. Otherwise, you're just creating a supermarket for them. So pest control, I think, is absolutely a critical part of the ecosystem service payments that you would need to make. There's payments to restrain and eradicate, to the extent that is feasible, the pests which destroy our carbon stores.
Well, thank you very much. I very much like your personal view. Yeah, thank you.
Right, so in that case, I will just wrap up this part of the meeting from your presentation and the questions and answers. Rod, feel really honoured that you were able to join us today and share Commission's view and some of your own views. Always enjoy listening to what you say as well as how you say it. And yeah, just alongside the committee members, our chair, deputy chair, and just thank you very much for the time that you've taken today. And we are very proud of our regional council strategy, which has got adaptation and mitigation all through it. And our next item on the agenda after this one will actually be to provide feedback to our staff on the draft of our climate action roadmap for our organisation going forward. I believe that whenever we can be of help to Commission, we are keen, and that, yeah, we just appreciate your time today with us.
And thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much for the work that you are doing. We are all in this together, and I am absolutely genuinely convinced we can make a better New Zealand if we get on and do this stuff. It is in our own self-interest. Kia ora.
Thank you. Absolutely, totally agree. We'll let you go, and we'll prepare the submission. Great. So the purpose of this paper was to prepare, was to provide a little bit more feedback for our staff as they prepare the submission for the Strategy and Policy Committee. So if anyone of the members here are mindful that a few have to go at 2:30 or just before, want to put anything forward for incorporation, now is the time. Did anybody have anything? Although we will obviously take a lot from that previous discussion and have that proper discussion at Strategy and Policy. That's okay. I did prepare some notes, so I'll just add a couple, which gives people a moment to think from having read Karen's paper. I personally really enjoyed that there's a focus in there on just transition plans for all regions. I'm mindful that there have only been some for Taranaki and Southland to date, and I think that especially for several sectors in our region, I'd like to strongly endorse that there will be more just transitions units or plans being developed. I enjoyed that there is, towards the back of the advice, a focus on better estimation on consumption-based emissions to complement greenhouse gas inventories. And I'll bring that point up again later on our greenhouse gas inventory, that if we start acknowledging at the very least that there is that additional embodied emission to do with what we import for consumption, then that will be something that doesn't get lost as we try and tackle everything else. And I enjoyed that part about the Stats New Zealand data to be more detailed. I think that can be both on a material and product level, like the Commission said, but also perhaps on geographical scales, going to more detail, because that probably helps the people who are doing our regional inventory as well for that correction. So those were the main points for me. Were there any other ones? Although I'm very welcome to pass them on to the team at any point before they prepare that agenda item.
Sorry, councillors, I just checking in from the discussion I heard. You would be keen to explore the small woodlots and riparian plantings opportunities, expand on that with advice. Ecosystem services credits to acknowledge the custodians of our land and also the opportunities for ongoing pest control.
Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting. I mean, I'm very much on the same page as what Rob said, and it seems a good opportunity to make a few noises to try and push the government in that direction.
Just the team sitting over in the corner there, so I'm just wanting to pass on what I heard from you, and also an encouragement for support for local government to enable renewable, and how do we do that within the strategic national context.
Ben?
Oh, I just thought it was very important what he said about 2.4 to 2.8 by the end of the century. I haven't heard that before. Much more serious than what we thought.
Yeah, so where we can emphasize that urgency. And for me, actually, I liked what he said around where is the voice for the unborn generations, and I really like what they've done in Wales, the Future Generations Commissioner. So it's perhaps something we could build in as to an example to give as to what would help in New Zealand as well, both to hold the Commission to account as well as every other part that sets regulation, parts of government. Yeah. Cool. Then what we'll do is we'll move and second the receipt. And could we add just a bit of text saying that the committee thanks Dr. Rod Carr for his presentation and then receives the report? Oh, that would be nice. We have presenters, it could be nice to have that in there. Karen, did you have anything else to add on this? Right. Yes. Great. I'm happy to move. Ben, are you happy to second? Going to be like that for this. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. And we'll move on to the second item. And I'm mindful that since we have lost a few committee members, I have already let everybody know that if they wish to, they can pass on feedback to our staff on following items in the next little brief while so that it can be incorporated. But obviously here, while we're at the meeting, it's good for everyone to hear that as well. I'm just mindful that many of those items will be coming back to the committee in August. So we're up to the Climate Action Roadmap. Yeah, Karen, would you like to introduce?
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, councillors, and following on from Rod Carr, this is our update of our Climate Action Roadmap. This has been reviewed and updated since it was first published in 2020, and we have reviewed it in light of legislative changes, the National Climate Change plans that Dr. Carr was speaking about, the Emissions Reduction Plan and the National Adaptation Plan, and the actions ascribed to local government in those. It includes updated climate science projections for the Waikato region. The Council's new strategic direction also has been incorporated into the actions we've included here. The purpose of our roadmap is to guide staff in their work plans and programs so that they incorporate climate change response into everything we do. Consistent with the advice you just heard, we must be doing everything we possibly can to reduce emissions and adapt to the changes we're already seeing. It's also a useful tool for guiding discussions with stakeholders, with our iwi partners and others in industry who are looking to see what are we doing as a collective in the Waikato region and how might we work together to achieve those outcomes we're seeking at national level. So for the purposes of the discussion here, we've presented this update in three parts. You've got the front end, we call it, the context setting part of the document, which the key changes to look for there are the updated climate projections, the natural hazards and climate risks, community engagement, and an expanded section on working with iwi Māori. There's also the greenhouse gas emissions inventory update, which is due to be finalised. That will be incorporated into this document before August when it comes back to this committee for final approval. The second section of the document is the pathways, and this is where all the changes have been incorporated into the actions we're proposing this council undertakes to reduce emissions and adapt. This is where we are really seeking your feedback, because we're taking this direction from you and we will be putting it through the long-term plan process. There will be costing it up and bringing it back to you through the long-term plan for discussion about how much money, how little funding, how fast, how slow we go with these proposals. So it is important that we hear your views on the pathway actions. And the final piece that you have here is a synthesis of all the climate policy that Council has already approved. And it's simply just an aggregate of everything that's already there for simplicity's sake, and will link from the climate roadmap. This will be an online document because, as you've heard, science is changing, our knowledge changes, the responses we make change. So we don't want to be publishing a hard copy every time we update. But we do recommend that this is reviewed regularly with a deep dive, as we've done, each triennium to support the new council's direction. So on that, I will pause, seek comments and feedback, recognizing that we've had a few people had to leave us. So please, whatever you can share now is much appreciated. Otherwise, I will hear from your colleagues and we will incorporate feedback and bring back to this committee at its August meeting with the intention of having it also go to council for adoption on the 31st of August. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and I was thinking we could give the feedback first on the front end of the document, and then we'll move to the pathways after, if that works for people, just to help stage and chunk and batch your notes, Karen. That'll be really good. And yeah, I'm really mindful that it's a large document, and going to council, I want everyone at council to feel like, you know, this is somewhat in the direction that they're happy with. So I'll definitely make sure to touch base with the councillors. I'm mindful that Tipper was probably the one who has to go soonest. So Tipper, did you have any feedback you wanted to put in before you have to go at some stage soon? Situation might be that she's already getting ready to go, and so we'll touch base with her after. In that case, does anybody have anything for the front end of the document that they wanted to raise? For Angela?
Can you just clarify what you mean by the front end?
Oh,
like what
sorry.
pages in the agenda? Sorry.
So it's
Pages.
on the agenda, it's from page 14 to when the pathways start, which is kind of the Word document.
14 to 39.
39, yeah. The colourful pages, basically, that I've already gone through. Go for it, Ben.
Oh, just on page 30. I raised this once before in the meeting. We're talking a lot here about the emissions, but the forestry sector's ability to remove emissions is not very clear in there, whether that can be highlighted or put down below, or it's the plus to the minuses that we've got.
Yeah, maybe that could be on the donut image.
I don't know if it would work on the donut image, but even if it was above or below, there's just
More highlighting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Dunbar-Smith. The team working on the report for the GHG emissions inventory will be able to pick that up and do that in the next iteration.
Which will update in this doc. Great. Angela, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And while I'm not a member of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to contribute before it goes up to full council. Yeah, the text within that part of the document looks fantastic to me. Probably just one thing that I, whenever we put anything out, like the pictures tell a big story. So if there are locations within the Waikato, it'd be great if we could reference yeah, where they're from. Yeah, because you might like to visit there. So that's all for now. I've got some more for the second part. Thank you.
That's nice. I've got a couple of points I can add. So one of them is, I want to say big thanks, including the planetary boundary effectiveness things. To bring up that page, but that's all right. Never mind. I really like it, but I would love to deepen its. Yeah, thank you. Love to deepen it and the understanding that goes with what flows from that. So the notes that I've got here is would be great to have more explanation of overshoot, and that one limit can have a knock-on effect for others with those planetary boundaries. Tipping points being explained a bit more to people who haven't come across that term to date. I would love to see in there that graph that Beat shows us around GDP versus well-being in a graph. It's from the Waikato Progress Indicators work. And explaining the concept of decoupling and the challenges for biodiversity and the need to lower footprints per capita. While that then leads on to the aspect that Aotearoa is already subscribed to the concept of wellbeing economies and the living standards framework, and our work that we do as well with linking in with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the concept of being more than just looking at GDP for wellbeing and the need to grow the things that we value and less of what we don't, which is kind of an obvious logical step after, just to help with that prioritization. And in context of that page, I'm just mindful that just a couple of weeks ago, the expanded team that came up with the planetary boundaries concept just over a decade ago has published a journal in Nature, the journal, an updated study that includes not just what a safe Earth system boundary is, but safe and just. And I'm just mindful with all our discussion around equity and just transitions and so forth, it makes sense to show that linkage to that latest, to just reference that latest research. That would be one part. And then in other pages where we talk about emissions in New Zealand and the region, just since came across in the Climate Commission's draft advice, they were signalling, just bringing in, like I said before, the acknowledgement of the other scope 3 emissions. I think you would refer to them as estimations of what is embedded in what we can import and consume to complement the greenhouse gas inventory. So just a very short paragraph or something to say, this is what's accounted for. There is other as well, just as an acknowledgement, not going to the extent of estimating what that might be, just mindful that since it is another component of emissions that the world sees, and it is a big part of action that people who read this can incorporate into thinking of actions that they can take in regards to consumption. And in our in-house emissions inventory page, I think in the last draft there was some text around organic soils and peat, and that we're expecting to include them in future. So that'd be great to see in there, just as a signalling. I think that was my complete feedback.
Yep. Thanks.
All right. So based on what I'm seeing here in the room, how about we move on to the pathways? I think, Ben, did you have? Oh, good question.
It's going to be fully designed once we have council feedback, because that means it spends less time going back and forth between the design team and us. Yeah.
Oh, your mic isn't on, sorry. Just pop your mic on.
Soils would be useful to have illustrated. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, we'll have a look at. The question was,
are
they
just
going
back
to be
to your
pictures? Yeah.
planetary boundaries. I'm still struggling to actually read and understand what it's showing.
Yeah, that's, I actually had a point. aligned with that, like more plain English? Because
Well,
I feel like if it's in context of everything I said, it actually will make more sense.
Well, the grey is not actually on your indicator chart. So there's an indicator of what does the grey mean. Page
Yeah,
18.
that's right. We can explain what that picture means.
Even if you just
in more
had
detail.
little arrows going to point out some of the key points. So obviously, clearly, consumption production is a major issue, but then nitrogen is an issue for production, but also only partly for consumption. So I don't
Just more
understand.
context to explain that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. For whatever image we put there, that it's well.
It's obviously highly complex, but
Yeah.
But we can certainly translate that. And it was just to hold the concept there to get your feedback on what,
Yeah, well, it's
what
great.
it was useful for you.
Yeah.
And it also directs our attention to those areas where we can focus that are within Waikato Regional Council's core areas of accountability.
I love that. Thank you. So on the pathways, the first one, is it biodiversity? First note I've got. On the biodiversity one, I just saw the headline statement I thought could be edited, particularly. I know it's just brief, but to me it reads very much from a Western worldview, and it brings in the ecosystem services and such, but always keen to not only look at things as a resource for people, but for its own
Intrinsic value.
Yeah, I don't know how to put it,
Right.
but just read that way to me. And I was a bit torn in the regional resilience one because I'm mindful how embedded the term managed retreat has become, but I'm also hearing from people working on the ground that there can be better terminology used, like planned relocations and other things, and I just wonder whether there's a softening of the language away from the more military language could help, but just something to consider, depending on how embedded that really has already become. Yep, cool. Then I'll just keep going for a little bit. The energy pathway. An overall one was there was one action in one of the pathways that talked about working with our territorial authority partners towards a consistent approach to things. And I really liked that starting point to an action in our commitments. I thought we could use that more often throughout the various pathways. But under the energy one, a particular one was to develop a consistent approach to considering council property for energy generation and storage. I realize it's not one I've necessarily brought up before, but just something to consider for the team as to whether that would add value, because I'm mindful a lot of our territorial partners do have large parts of land that could be used, that they're considering here and there, but no consistent approach. So that our community could then get benefit from. I thought in the planting and habitat restoration pathway, the protecting forests from both removal or vegetation removal and pest damage didn't come through, and that's what Stu Kneebone was talking about before, because it is to keep those sinks effective, and yeah, that I just thought it hadn't come through quite as much yet.
Probably covered in biosecurity. That's part of the interconnectedness, but certainly re-emphasize it there. Yep, thank you.
Yep, I've mentioned that. I thought once you've got the advice from council, the steer from council at the end of the month from the submission, probably quite good to double back to update the roadmap, since we have until August now, to include what we're feeling like we're hearing from the council is the direction that they'll go. And in the agriculture and soils one, I'll just keep rolling through until I'm done. There's only 3 left. I thought we could refer to topsoil loss, since it's such a large topic. I didn't see the wording in there for that. The relative size, to give people a bit of an indication as to the size of the organic soils. From my reading, in the last item in the agenda, it looks like the organic soils will be a quite large component, large as the second and third biggest categories that are in our greenhouse gas inventory. So we'll talk about it later, but I just thought rather than just mentioning the number of million tonnes or something, it could be good to give some relativity to that in the narrative to allow people to comprehend it, because I've struggled a lot in the past with the numbers and getting your head around what's big and what's little. And I noticed that Rod Carr talked about the future of food and the threats faced by the sector of other things. I just thought that could be good to just note in there. And under transport, I thought we did such good work last triennium on supporting the community transport to step up, whether there would be an action under transport to further support options and opportunities for community transport to make it easy for those informal public transport networks to gear up faster and easier and so forth. And then under community funding and investment pathway, I just thought I'd mention it read a lot like there was a lot on investment, but not as much on the community funding. So something to balance there. I have lots of tiny little edits, which if Karen will permit, I will show her and give her a document.
That sounds like best option.
It's just like the spelling things and other bits.
Best option.
But I know they can help considering lots of eyes on paper. Yeah, go for it. Warren, nice to have your input.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, just a couple of things. I haven't read through it a hell of a long way, but just for me, a little bit more alignment with the certainly the biosecurity coming back through into the coastal marine and the freshwater side of things. We've got some real challenges in those space, and as things get warmer, it's only going to get worse. So I know we have a biosecurity, biodiversity spot, but just to see that come back into those other two categories. Thank you.
Angela, did you have anything on the path?
Yeah, just on page 51 where we talk about future proof, just and we specifically reference Hamilton, Waikato and Waipa, noting that we now Waitemata is back in and out. I think to be consistent with the future proof strategy, if we just say future proof councils, and then that avoids
update
people jumping in and out all the time.
That's good. Thank you.
And I was just going to say around transport. We just yesterday updated the priorities for the RLTP moving forward. And just if we can check with the team there that it's. Thank you.
Cool. In that case, could do is got a whole another lot of notes for a whole other update. Great, Karen. I'll move that we just receive the latest update, and Ben, if I could get you to second. Yeah, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Great. Got that item complete, and we can move on to the next item, which was with Leah Dickey on the update about regional energy strategy. So Blair, I let the committee know that we'll take everything as read, but is there any comment or mention or particular thing you would like to note before we just have a bit of a chat?
Kia ora, councillors. This follows on very nicely from what Dr. Carr mentioned, the recognition that if New Zealand is going to decarbonise its economy, much of that will be done through electrification. And this is just an update, particularly updating the item to the previous council's committee, Climate Action Committee, in March last year, which and also providing some information on the interest that has been expressed in relation to access to those resources that contain energy and the different roles of ourselves, regional council, as well as district councils for that. There is a presentation that goes into that in a little bit more detail, and perhaps some of the questions may occasion a reference to that, but just recognising that as well as being pull factors in that New Zealand has national targets to achieve, there are push factors as well, and this is where the climate influences on the present land use is causing a challenge for the current water-based economy that we have, particularly north of Hamilton and into for other regions into Northland as well. And that's why we're seeing a lot of interest in solar, and that is grid connected property scale solar, and just recognising that central government is mindful of the need to remove barriers, make it easy, and to electrify our economy. The challenge is there. There's, as was mentioned, 170% of our current installed capacity is going to be needed by 2050. Just a fun fact, as of 1 o'clock today, 93% of our electricity was from renewables. Some coal is being used at the moment. It's a still day, pretty much, so not much wind, but we've had a wet season, and therefore there's a lot of fuel in the hydro systems around the country. The best and the strongest part of the grid is between Taupō and Auckland. Auckland's one of our major load, was the major load in the country at the moment for electricity, and that is why we're seeing the interest in the North Waikato area. With that, perhaps lots more to say, but I'll just leave it to questions and respond to what's of interest to your committee.
Okay. I had a question, and that was page 85 of the agenda, paragraph 39. You make reference to there not being any agency responsible for kind of a comprehensive overview of energy. I haven't got it in front of me, but from my notes, that's kind of what it said. I was wondering what you meant as to what it would look like if we did. Yeah. Is that?
I may be working off a draft.
Okay.
You're saying paragraph 39, is it?
Even with the increased interest in central government ministries and of industry bodies and operators, there remains no agency responsible for the integration of all energy-related interests at either national or regional level.
Yeah. That hasn't changed from the impetus that, the reason why this organisation was keen to develop a regional scale energy strategy. And Councillor Dunbar Smith knows all about that one, in 2009, because the roles are shared between the elements of local government. The electricity distribution is covered by one agency, an entity, Transpower. The generation and retailing of electricity is under another piece of legislation. So there isn't an overall strategy. But central government has recognised this,
okay.
And 2024, the national energy strategy is being prepared by MB, and that was in the emissions reduction plan, the national emissions reduction plan, and has been budgeted for May last year. So that's already underway. However, the recognition that we as a region have a lot of skin in the game already, and the interest in renewables is really targeted towards our region, and this item identifies that. And by reviewing what we understand to be the situation and where the interest is, will allow us to be able to participate in the national process of identifying where we should go from an energy perspective. Yeah, that's what that was meant to. Long answer, but.
Thank you. Councillor Ben.
Oh, so are you going to input into the national strategy, and in what way?
Well, it's fair. As a council, yeah, the intention is that as the national strategy is developed, we have already an understanding of the Waikato situation, and we're updating that, and that will be of interest. It has already been identified as of being of interest to NB staff working on this. So yes, there is an intent to not just be involved at the back end through submission processes and the like, but also the intent is to offer what we know so that the national picture is informed by our understanding of what the Waikato region already is involved in and understands.
Yeah, I mean, the paper's good. It's like there's a whole lot of additional capacity sitting here. This is your page 7, page 84. You've got the current installed electricity generation capacity, and then a whole table of the additional capacity, wind, solar.
That's in the presentation, Councillor.
Yeah.
What I'll do, Blair, is we'll just bring up that slide where you've got a really cool map, which will help you talk
Slide
to
11?
that, I think. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just coming up now, and then you could answer that question.
Oh, no, it's good. I'm just saying it's good. It's, yeah. And the question there was West Coast offshore, 2,950 megawatts. Is that tidal? But there's also a fixed offshore wind farm and then a floating offshore wind farm.
Yeah, 2 stages, as
Yeah,
I understand.
two stages,
Right.
and the fixed stuff is within the CMA, and
Right.
the floating stuff outside. Yeah, that's wind. That's not. It's offshore, but yeah.
So nobody's looking at wind wave power anymore.
That was investigated during the 2009 strategy. It's not really relevant for the Waikato situation as it is at the moment. This is concentrating on existing technologies that are relevant for us. Our tidal range is too small, and our harbours are too shallow for the types of turbines or the that is around. Perhaps Cook Strait might be appropriate. The Kaipara Harbour entrance has been looked at in the past. There's much more mature technology around.
And with the 5,000 megawatt capacity, does that get us close to the 170% increase needed nationally? How much do we play in solving the national problem, Bella?
Well, currently we have the existing national generation is 9,500 megawatts. The planned or the interest that has been shown to date in the Waikato is an extra 5,000 megawatts, 5 gigawatts. We're going to need between 400 and 500 megawatts per year for 30 years. I mean, that's a massive amount. The current 9,500 megawatts took over 100 years to build. We're going to have to do that in 15 to get to 175 in 28 years. It's heroic.
Which is why I asked that question to Rod Carr, which he gave a very optimistic answer for.
What I have been impressed by is the amount of cashed up international interest in offshore wind, looking at not just making New Zealand 100% renewable, but why not 600%, and manufacturing using that renewable energy. That is what international parties are talking about, Power to X, which is something quite new for us, and something that we need to keep in mind that it's a possibility into the future. There was a map. I did also identify in table 1 the interest that Transpower are now publishing on their website. If you can perhaps go to the next one, William. These are Transpower's planning regions, and you'll note that Waikato region spans 2 of them, not just the Waikato, but also the central North Island, because the Waikato region pretty much is the top half of our region north of Whakamaru. And in the past, there's been some interest in grid connections. What you see there is 7,000 megawatts of interest north of Whakamaru in our region. And this relates to both battery storage and new generation. And in the central North Island, 5,700 megawatts, including wind, solar, and geothermal as well. Auckland, you'll see there's a lot of interest in grid connection there, but that's presumed to be battery and distribution exit points on the grid. So it's quite, when you look at a map like that, you see, wow, the Waikato does punch above its weight. And you'll know yourself, in January in 2007, this region supplied over half of New Zealand's electricity because it was a dry year. Got a good mix of renewables, and the region has a role. Rodcar mentioned the consenting issues associated with that. That's one of the main points that were picked up in the 2009 strategy. We put that in the regional policy statement. 11 of the 27 recommendations from that strategy ended up in our second generation operative regional policy statement, and district plans have to give effect to that. So while it's the regional role to allocate access to water, that's hydro, because it's a diversion, and geothermal, there's no consent. Solar PV and wind aren't consentable under the RMA, but they're regulated on the land use effects of the technology. So the visual effect of a wind turbine and that sort of thing. And that's a territorial council's regulatory role, and so is transmission. But regional councils have the role of the strategic integration of infrastructure with land use, and district councils have to give an effect to the regional policy statement. So that's the way it's already covered within this region.
I'll just get you to wrap it up soon because I've got Warren waiting as well.
Sure. Yep. We've also got, and that's spatially relevant because renewable resources occur where they occur. So that actually gives us a lot of opportunity to input, and goes back to your previous question, input into the national energy strategy, because that's now looking very much spatially, spatial activities.
Yeah, just thank you, Jennifer. Just really quickly, one thing that occurred to me, we talk about storage. Obviously, they're intermittent type generation sorts of things. Is there anything going on in that space where these generators will be required to provide storage?
It is an issue, not to my knowledge, but storage is being is recognised, either it be through chemical storage, hydrogen, ammonia, whether it be through battery storage electrically, or you've heard of the Lake Onslow battery project. There's also University of Waikato people recognising that storage of water as potential pumped hydro
Release, yeah.
is possible in this region between Whakamaru and Tokoroa, potentially.
Yeah, it'd be just something nice to see that work's going in at that, because there's no point producing this extra capacity and then not being able to use it at the times we require it. Yeah.
Hydrogen and ammonia are chemicals that are chemical storage that are being looked at as well.
Thank you. Thanks.
And we haven't mentioned biomass and land use, but that's.
Yeah. Ben.
I just wanted to say it's a good paper, and I'm sorry we didn't get to see the PowerPoint. I wonder if we could bring it to strategy and policy to run through the PowerPoint, because we've run short of time today.
Yeah, or we can email it out as well. Is that right, Blair?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's 70 megawatt, right? So we can put a link.
Or is there?
We can put it on Councillor's Kāinga, then you have it.
Kāinga, yeah.
Yeah. And it'll also be on the website
Internet.
because it's been presented here now too, so you can
It's
access
just,
it several
it's just
ways.
I think the energy stuff links so much with the climate change stuff, which links so much with the farm plan. You know, it's like
Totally.
it's a good way of getting an overview that covers everyone's region, not just the sub districts. So useful if
Great
we
point.
can run it.
Yeah, we'll share it for sure. And from myself, the thank you for the memo. Those are always really good. My feedback, and then I'll go to Tipper, is just around the scope of the energy strategy. It mentioned about a gas transition plan, but then my mind went to, well, what about a coal or an oil transition plan? Are we being comprehensive when we're looking at the scope for the strategy? And I think it's just my view, personal view, is that we will mature into a space where we realise how difficult all that generation that's being projected to be needed is, and we start talking quite seriously about energy demand and how to be more efficient and how to look at giving people options around that side of things as well. So I'm just, I suppose my question is whether this will just be an energy supply strategy or whether this will be a more holistic strategy where we can add in the complexities of all these parts as we try to navigate, including, say, the findings from our local Climate Adaptation Act, mentioning the challenges we're seeing there and other more intrinsic parts of energy in general, like rising energy expenditures, rebound effects like Jevons paradox and all that stuff. Will that be in the scope?
Absolutely. One of the findings from the 2009 energy strategy, and this came from generators and retailers themselves, was that the cheapest watt is the one you don't have to generate. That's efficiency.
Thanks. Tipper.
Oh, kia ora, and thank you for the paper. Could you just go back to your map slide?
Yeah, we'll bring it up for you.
Possible.
Is that the first one or the second one?
The second one.
Yeah.
The one that
Bring it up
was.
now. There you go.
Oh no, the one before that, so Aroha Mai, the one with the round circles on it.
There you go.
Yeah, that one. So there's currently where I'm living, well, definitely between here and Pōkeno, a lot of those live yellow bubbles are being formed, the ones that are referring to solar. There's no new information in our communities about how, again, what does good look like in and around this, but there's a lot of live applications and development of solar and already an energy dense area. So I'm just wondering, how do we improve the community understanding of what's happening in their area? And then just what's our role in terms of public education around that? Because these are big solar farms that are being planned throughout the back of Te Kaifata, Huntly, and over to the coast, as well as wind farming applications. So rather than everybody repeat the learning, I'm just wondering what can we do as a information to the community give? I know it's a bit different, but yeah, I've been asked by so many constituents and I don't have a firm view about what good looks like. The other one that came up, I know it's a bit to the left of this, but is waste to energy and current applications. Those are the topics in my community, so I just put them on the table. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yep. Karen's mentioning she'll pick that up and bring it back. And I'm really glad you raised it as well, because it's again one of those things where as part of our actions and the roadmap, we can work with our territorial partners to make sure there's some consistent approach to how they educate communities on all of this. Because I'm mindful various districts are getting approached and they might approach in different ways. Thank you. In that case, might Tipper, if you're happy to move, I'll second that we receive Blair's report.
Happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Awesome. Then we will move on to making good time. It's just after 3. And we'll take the next item as read as well. Have a chat to Hayden Jones and Alice Wheatley Wilson. Please come on up. And so the main points are that this is a progress update for the Waikato Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory of 2021-2022. And it provides the region and districts with an understanding of our emissions and opportunities for mitigation. And just the initial findings are well laid out already in the memo. Thank you. Is there anything that else that you wanted to just get our focus on as we have a two-way chat about this for a few minutes before you come back next time?
Yeah, so we'll be back in August to go over the final results. But just some key things to highlight are that there will be a main report that's due at the end of this month, so 30th of June,
Awesome.
as alongside some draft district reports due at the same time. And also we have a freshwater management unit study underway at the moment for the Waiho Piako district. And there will also be a supplementary technical report on organic soils emissions. Just want to highlight that it's also the 3rd time we've done this inventory, so we'll be able to see some trends over time. Just an update, really. Some of the limitations that we've come across around data collection slowed us down a little bit initially. Just some issues around commercial sensitivities, so waste and fuel data. So that's put us back a little bit. I think the report was originally scoped for maybe March or May, so a couple of month and a half back.
Yeah.
In terms of preliminary results, these have pretty much all changed as of yesterday. Hayden and I have a draft report on our desk ready to read. I won't speak to the results that are in the report too much. In terms of future timeline, should be ready soon and ready to present in August.
Awesome, thank you. When I was reading it, it was so frustrating to read about the data access issues. And but as I understand, you are working through those to try and make it simpler for future years. Is that right?
Yeah, there's also issues around the timing of the, I guess, more national top-down approaches and resources. So like the
agricultural
survey, census and the national inventory, those come in sort of within a couple of weeks of when we were supposed to have the first draft done. So we'll probably revise when we do this inventory in future, I think.
Do you feel that there were recommendations on the one from 3 years ago? Do you feel like we've built upon that methodology and those recommendations, and we will have new recommendations at the end of this report as well for how to improve things in future?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of bringing the organic soils report in, and also the FMU should bring a new perspective in, as well as identifying trends over time.
Awesome.
I
couldn't remember what they were, but I just remember there were recommendations.
Yeah, and certainly there will be recommendations as part of this inventory as well.
Thank you. I wanted to mention from my comment before around since the Climate Commission's draft advice talks about advancing estimates of consumption-based emissions, it would be great to acknowledge that that is something that can complement greenhouse gas inventories. That could be in there somewhere.
It was just for Karen that this on page 88, the percentages, the 69 for agriculture and the minus 48 for forestry. That was what I was trying to get across. People get really disillusioned if they think there's nothing significant you can do. Yeah, so it's just to point that out. Obviously, that's going to change when you get union numbers in. Yeah.
And the pretty graphs and things as well to communicate that. Awesome. Okay. Well, in that case, any other? Cool. Then thank you very much for just giving us the update, and I look forward to getting the full discussion when we meet again in August. But yeah, good to see the initial data, since there's some positive bits in there I noted, in particular in regards to transport, but we'll leave it for next time.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay.
Thanks, Alice and Kate. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And your work. Thank you.
All right, then if I'll move to receive the report. Ben could second. That would be great. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Fantastic. We're on to the last item, which is the update on the Waikato Regional Climate Change Risk Assessment, which I believe yourself, Karen,
Yes.
presenting.
Yes.
Great. Phase 1 is done. Phase 2 is stuttering.
Yeah, well, let's not say stuttering. This has been a managed approach to ensuring that staff are able to attend to those things that are most urgent and pressing.
Of course. Yeah.
So, thank you. This is just an update, and we're very quick to let you know. Yes, phase 1 is done, and we had fantastic input and engagement from our stakeholders. Stage 2 got underway with encouraging velocity, and then we were hit by cyclones at the end of last year, then Cyclone Gabriel, and our staff, subject matter experts, our own, but also other councils and utilities and lifelines were involved in responding to that and are still involved in recovery to a degree. So we have had to pause, and just for the record, that was unfortunate because it was one of the chief executive's KPIs. However, I understand that CERC understood the issues and accepts that we are resetting this project, and we will complete it in the next financial year, 23-24 financial year. In the interim, our coastal and marine subject matter experts will complete the risk assessment of the coastal and marine environment by the end of this month, which speaks to your point, Warren, Councillor Meyer, that we have to look at those issues affecting our precious coastal resources. So that's the update. We are resetting the report, the project. We will bring that back to you as we go through over the next.
Now that's really good news, considering we've got the about the coastal piece being underway well, since we've got the coastal plan that's in our minds, even though we're not doing our council aren't doing a lot on that in the near future, but it's just good to be able to keep that in mind, as well as yesterday Councillor Mara and I are attending the Haere briefed on a whole lot of these biosecurity issues and such. It's great for the coast to get the attention always. So first off the question was, do you have an idea of what the next item will be after coastal marine, or is that still getting worked out as part of that reset?
We actually will be running a number of concurrent workshops, so it'll be across the natural environment, the built environment, the lifelines. So it'll be across the range of risks that we've identified, and there are a significant number and significant hazards, but they will be dependent on stakeholders' availability, which is anything else. So we will be trying to push that through as quickly as possible, given that we have been delayed. We want to get it done.
I thought I had, just reflecting on last triennium, was that we had a small subset of councillors from the Climate Committee as like a governance oversight group. So if the committee feels at any stage that we do want to do that again here, it was 2 or 3 councillors meeting up with Karen and 1 or 2 other staff members just to get a more regular update on how the project's going, where the barriers could be removed and other things fed back on to help navigate through the challenges, then we could look at doing that again. But at this point, we'll just let you do that reset and then we'll touch base. Or did you have any other comments, Karen?
The
It worked quite well, I thought.
yeah, the project plan and update will include governance, and that is likely to be an intersectoral group, including iwi, and that would help with being able to engage and connect with the stakeholders that we need to involve in this.
Yeah, that sounds great, actually. Okay, then Ben, if you would like to move and I would like to second to receive this, that would be fantastic. All those in favour, please say aye. Carried. Awesome. Well, that then brings us to a close, just at 3:15-ish p.m. And yeah, just a big thanks again to everyone who's made the time to participate. Mindful we had to rush it a little bit more than usual. I'll close with the karakia unless somebody else would like to. I'll do it. I'll prepare it a little bit. So, unahia mai te uru tapu nui. Kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te hinengaro. I te ara takatū, hoia rā e rongo, e whakaaerea ake ki runga, kia tina, haumi e, hui e, tā iki e. Thank you everyone, and we'll meeting closed.